Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are not just stepping into a history book. We are stepping into a shadow. We're going back to a time and place that is often painted in these really bright, glorious colors.
The Golden Age.
The so-called Golden Age of Poland, the 16th and 17th centuries. But the sources we have today, well, they tell a very different story, a much, much darker story.
It is a fascinating juxtaposition, isn't it? You look at the surface and you see, Renaissance architecture, incredible poetry, the absolute height of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's power. But if you scratch that surface, which is exactly what our source material from Historia Filozofii Polskiej does.
Specifically, Chapter 3.
Exactly, Chapter 3. You find something bubbling underneath that is, I think, genuinely terrifying.
Terrifying is the right word. We're talking about a landscape filled with what the people at the time would have called theological monsters. We're talking about a very real, palpable fear of the devil, of political chaos, and this burning, almost radioactive question. Is human reason a gift from God, or is it a weapon forged by Satan himself?
And that is the absolute core tension of this entire period. We are looking at pages 101 to 148 of the text, which covers the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. But this is not just about church politics or, dusty old books.
Not at all.
It's about a collision, a violent collision. On one side, you have the radical Reformation, and we're talking specifically about the Polish brethren who were willing to take logic and, with it, dismantle the very nature of God.
And on the other side?
On the other, you have the crushing weight of the Counter-Reformation. The Jesuits, the Catholic state fighting back not with logic but with fear, with authority.
So our mission today is to unpack this clash. We really want to get into how these theological disputes weren't abstract at all. They were genuine matters of life and death. And we want to capture that specific Polish flavor of the conflict.
Which is so unique.
It really is. This idea that you have extreme tolerance existing right next door to the most extreme, violent hatred.
And in the end, the triumph of dogmatism. It is, in a way, a story about the death of the mind.
A really tragic story. So let's set the scene. It's the mid-1500s. Europe is, it's on fire with the ideas of Luther and Calvin. But in Poland, something strange happens. The Reformation doesn't just arrive. It mutates.
It does. And to understand this, you have to realize that the ground was already pretty fertile for this kind of thing. You had influences from Jan Hus in Bohemia and Wycliffe in England reaching Poland much earlier. But the social divide was absolutely key.
How so?
The Reformation in Poland was never really a peasant movement. It was a movement of the nobility, the szlachta, and the educated townspeople. It was intellectual from the very beginning. And because the Polish nobility valued their golden liberty above all else, they felt completely free to question absolutely everything.
When you say everything, you mean everything. They didn't just stop at questioning the authority of the Pope.
Oh, no, that was just the starting point.
Yeah.
They went straight for the heart of Christian dogma. They went for the Trinity.
And this is what the source calls the scary insight of the Polish Reformation.
Precisely. It evolved, or mutated, as you said, into anti-Trinitarianism. This is the movement we now call the Polish Brethren, or as their enemies called them, the Arians. Now, you have to understand, to the established church, and even to mainstream Protestants like Calvin, this was horrifying.
This was the ultimate heresy.
It was the worst thing you could possibly say, because if you deny the Trinity, you are fundamentally denying that Jesus Christ was God. Right.
You're stripping him of his divinity.
You're reducing him to a man, a perfect man maybe, a divinely inspired teacher, sure, but still a man. And if he's just a man, then the whole structure of salvation, the idea of a divine sacrifice paying for the sins of humanity, it just starts to crumble. It felt like they were unmaking Christianity from the inside out.
And they actually had a headquarters for this unmaking, a place called Raków.
Raków. It's incredible. They called it the Sarmatian Athens. Can you imagine a small provincial town that suddenly becomes the intellectual capital of radical thought in Europe?
It sounds like a philosophical Woodstock.
Kind of, but with more Latin and, as you said, a lot more impending doom. You had outcasts from Italy, from Germany, from France, people who would have been burned at the stake anywhere else, all gathering in Raków to print books, to debate logic, and to essentially reconstruct religion from scratch based on reason.
So to the people inside, it's Athens. To everyone on the outside.
It's a den of blasphemy, a fortress of the devil, a cancer that needed to be cut out.
Okay, so let's meet some of these monsters of orthodoxy,
Yeah.
the people who are really keeping the bishops up at night. The first one on our list is a man named Piotr of Goniodes, also known as Gonesius.
A fascinating figure, and an unusual one because he was a peasant priest, which is quite rare in this highly intellectual, noble-dominated circle. He studied in Italy, and that's where he absorbed these radical anti-Trinitarian ideas, and he brought them back to Poland like a contagion.
But he was unique, you said.
Very, because Piotr hated metaphysical speculation.
Wait, he hated metaphysics, but he's a theologian, a philosopher. That seems like a contradiction.
It does, but in his mind, it was the metaphysics, all the complex Greek philosophy that thinkers like Aquinas had used to explain the Trinity. He saw that as the original source of all heresy. He thought it had corrupted the simple message of the Bible.
So he's a back-to-basics kind of guy.
Exactly. He wanted a simple biblical faith. The problem is, his simple faith led him to an incredibly radical pacifism. He preached that a true Christian cannot, under any circumstances, carry a sword.
Okay, that's a dangerous idea in a state like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
It's more than dangerous. It's essentially treasonous. He was telling the nobility to lay down their arms, to give up their swords, while the Tatars and the Muscovites were constantly raiding the borders. He also said they couldn't hold public office. This is where the theological immediately becomes political and existential.
Right, it's not just a debate anymore, it's a threat to national security.
Absolutely. And then you get figures who build on this, like Marcin Czechowicz. He wrote the Christian Conversations in 1575, which was basically the Unitarian Catechism.
And he took the idea of Jesus as a man even further.
He took it to its dark, demanding, logical conclusion. He argued that Jesus was a man, yes, a man born without original sin, but he earned his divinity.
He earned it.
Through suffering, through absolute perfect obedience to God's will, culminating on the cross.
So the implication for his followers is, if we are to be like Christ,
we must suffer. We must choose to separate ourselves from the world. Czechowicz was a firm believer in Anabaptism, adult baptism. You see, you can't just be born a Christian. That's meaningless. You have to consciously choose it as an adult. And that choice involves a radical separation from the world.
What does that mean, the world?
It means the corrupt state, the courts, the military. It's a very stark, almost monastic view of life, but for lay people. You're supposed to create a parallel society of the pure, separate from the damned.
It sounds incredibly demanding and isolating.
And then there's the guy who went too far even for these radicals. Simon Budny.
An outcast among outcasts.
Exactly. Budny is the cold utilitarian of the group. A brilliant mind, no doubt. He translated the Bible. But he was accused of Judaizing.
What does that mean in this context?
It means he focused so much on the Old Testament, on the law, and on the pure humanity of Jesus that his critics said he'd practically abandoned Christianity and returned to Judaism. But where he really broke with the others was politically. He was the complete opposite of Piotr of Goniodes.
So he wasn't a pacifist?
Not at all. But he looked at the pacifists and their little separate communities and basically said, this is illogical. This is unsustainable.
A pragmatist.
A cold pragmatist. He argued that if you want your religion to survive, you need the protection of the state. You can't just opt out. Therefore, Christians can use the sword to defend the innocent. They can and should hold public office to ensure justice. It was this pragmatic, almost Machiavellian twist on Arianism.
He was trying to make heresy viable, mainstream even.
And for that, his own radical peers excommunicated him. He was too cold, too rational, too willing to compromise with the world they had rejected. He died an outcast, rejected by everyone.
Wow. This really sets the stage for the man who finally managed to organize all this intellectual chaos, the Italian exile, Faustus Socinus, or Faust Susin, as he's known in Poland.
Socinus is the key. He's the systematizer. The others were, prophets and preachers. Socinus was a logician. This is where we get the term Socinianism. And if we're talking about shadows and fear, Socinus is the one who truly terrified the theologians.
Why him specifically?
Because his approach was so coldly, brutally rational. He didn't have the fire of a preacher. He had the sharp, precise logic of a surgeon.
And he wanted to strip religion of all its mystery.
Completely. And you have to remember, in the 16th century, religion was mystery. It was paradox. Socinus came along and said, let's just look at this logically. And the first thing he tackled was original sin.
Okay, let's really unpack this because it's fundamental. The standard Christian view, Catholic and Protestant, is that Adam sinned in the Garden of Eden, and now all of humanity is born corrupt.
Yeah. Correct. We are inherently broken from birth, stained with sin, and we desperately need the church and God's grace to fix us. Socinus looked at this and said, no.
No.
No. He argued that Adam's fall was Adam's problem. It didn't corrupt human nature biologically or spiritually. It just set a bad example. It created a bad habit for humanity.
So what you're saying is he believed we are free.
We are terrifyingly free. Socinus argued that the human will is perfectly intact. We can, through our own power, choose good over evil.
Why is that a scary idea? I mean, to a modern ear, that sounds empowering.
It's incredibly scary to the entire religious establishment of the 17th century, because if you are free to choose good on your own, then you don't necessarily need the church's mediation. You don't need the sacraments in the same way to wash away a sin you weren't born with, and it utterly terrified the Calvinists because it completely destroys their idea of predestination.
Of course. If we have free will, we can't be predestined.
But Socinus didn't stop there. He took the next logical step. If there is no original sin,
then there's nothing that needs to be redeemed.
Exactly. This leads to what his opponents called the uselessness of redemption. Socinus argued that Christ did not need to die on the cross to pay off some cosmic debt to God for humanity's sin, because there was no debt. God is all-powerful. If he wants to forgive us, he can just forgive us. He doesn't need a blood sacrifice.
So in this system, why did Jesus die? What was the point of the crucifixion?
It was a demonstration, a moral example. Christ was the ultimate teacher who showed us the path to salvation through his life and his obedience. His death and resurrection were proof that if we follow his example, we too can be granted eternal life. But he was not a cosmic sacrifice.
That turns the central event of Christianity into a teaching moment.
Which, to the establishment, was the definition of theological anarchy. It drains the crucifixion of its mystical saving power. And then we get to the idea that, as you said earlier, really gives you the creeps. Mortalism.
Yeah, the void. This is where his logic goes somewhere very dark.
It is. Most Christians, then and now, believe the soul is naturally immortal. When you die, your soul continues to exist and goes to heaven, hell, or purgatory. Socinus and his followers looked at the Bible and said, where exactly does it say that?
They couldn't find it.
They argued that immortality is not an inherent property of the soul. It is a gift from God, a gift given only to the righteous at the final resurrection.
And for everyone else.
Annihilation, total and complete cessation of being. There's no eternal torment in a fiery hell, but there is something that is perhaps more frightening to the human ego, the void. You just end.
That changes the stakes completely. It's not be good or you'll burn forever. It's be good or you will simply cease to exist.
It is the ultimate existential threat. And they wrapped all of this in a philosophy they called rational religion. Andrzej Wisłowski, a later Socinian, actually wrote a treatise with that title. Their core principle was this: religion must be logical. If a dogma, any dogma, contradicts reason, then the dogma must be wrong.
That sounds so much like the Enlightenment a century before its time.
It was. They were direct precursors. But in the context of the 1600s, it felt like they were taking a scalpel and dissecting God, leaving only a cold, logical machine. And this had social consequences.
Right. They weren't just seen as theologically wrong. They were seen as dangerous.
They were viewed as having a Manichaean worldview, seeing the world as a stark battleground between good and evil. They separated themselves from the corrupt Catholic state, refusing public office, refusing to go to war. So to a patriotic Catholic noble, these people weren't just heretics. They were internal enemies. They were enemies of the state.
Which brings us to the inevitable reaction. You can't have a movement this radical, this corrosive to the existing order, without a massive pushback. And that brings us to Section 3, the Counter-Reformation, or as you put it, the Empire Strikes Back.
And the shock troops of this empire are, without a doubt, the Jesuits. They arrive in Poland in 1565. They were specifically invited by one man, Cardinal Stanisław Hozdzius.
Hozdzius seems like the calculating mastermind behind the whole operation.
He was a brilliant church strategist.
Yeah.
He understood that you couldn't just shout at the heretics and burn their books. That wasn't working. You had to out-educate them, out-organize them, and outmaneuver them politically. But his core strategy was one of rigid, unyielding dogmatism.
He was the one who hated translations of the Bible into Polish.
Famously so. Keep it in Latin. Keep it controlled by the clergy. Don't let the common people interpret for themselves, because that's where all this trouble starts. He viewed heresy not as an intellectual error, but as a plague. And you don't dialogue with a plague, you quarantine it and you stamp it out.
So Hozdzius provided the cold institutional authority. But the fire, the rage that came from someone else, a man named Stenio Wojciechowski.
The Chimera. What a character. He was a walking contradiction. He was a Catholic priest who got married, had children, and openly defied the Pope on the issue of clerical celibacy.
And yet
he was a fanatical, foaming-at-the-mouth defender of Catholicism against all forms of Protestantism.
And his rhetoric, the language he used, it was just violent.
Incredibly so. His polemics against the reformer Andrzej Friczys-Modzewski are just filled with venom. Wojciechowski had this vision of the Polish state as a divine theocracy. In his mind, the priest stands above the king. The spiritual sword is mightier than the temporal one.
So he's mixing nationalism and religion into this really potent, dangerous cocktail.
It's a form of what you could call dark patriotism. He argued that religious unity is the only thing that guarantees the safety and survival of the nation. Therefore, if you are a heretic, you are not just theologically wrong, you are an alien. You are a spy. You are a foreign body, a disease that is destroying the sacred national organism from within.
He completely dehumanized them.
And that rhetoric of dehumanization gets picked up and amplified by the great preachers of the era, the guys in the pulpit speaking directly to the people, Piotr Skarga and Fabian Burkowski.
Skarga is the more famous one, the master orator. He's the one giving these thundering sermons, predicting the fall of Poland, warning that God will punish the nation for its sins.
And the greatest sin of all, in his eyes, was tolerating heresy. But Burkowski, if Skarga was the thunder, Burkowski was the terrifying, jagged lightning. He was the Baroque preacher of doom.
We have his work, O Exorbitant Jack, which translates to On Exorbitances from 1632.
The title tells you everything you need to know. Heresy isn't a different opinion, it's an exorbitance, a deviation from the natural order, a monstrosity. And Burkowski didn't argue with logic, not like the Arians did. He used fear, pure, unadulterated psychological fear.
What kind of language are we talking about here? Give us a taste of it.
He called heresy a literal pact with the devil. He described heretics not as people, but as monsters, plagues, cancers, ulcers on the body of the Commonwealth. His sermons were just these long streams of invective. He treated Arianism not as a theology to be debated, but as a demonic infection that had to be burned out with a hot iron.
It's not an argument, it's an exorcism.
Exactly. And then you have writers like Wojciechowski, who went even further and literally accused the Arians of devil worship in his book Pogrom Diabła Ariańskiego, The Defeat of the Aryan Devil.
So the strategy was clear.
It was total dehumanization. By imputing devil worship to them, he made it impossible for any good, God-fearing Catholic to even speak to them, let alone consider their arguments. It was a brilliant and terrifying campaign of psychological warfare.
So you have this incredible polarization. On one side, the cold, razor-sharp logic of the Socinians, dissecting the nature of God. On the other side, you have the fiery, emotional, terrifying rhetoric of the Counter-Reformation, screaming about monsters and plagues and devils.
And somehow, in the middle of this intellectual and spiritual war zone, there was a brief, flickering candle of hope. This brings us to the battle for tolerance.
Section 4. And the centerpiece of this has to be the Confederation of Warsaw from 1573. This is famous, isn't it? The document where the nobles swear peace, starting with the line, "We who differ in religion."
It is a legal anomaly in the context of 16th century Europe. You have to remember, this is happening just a year after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, where tens of thousands of Protestants were slaughtered. And in Poland, the Catholic and Protestant nobility are sitting down and swearing a legal oath not to kill each other over religion.
It was a remarkable moment of light.
It was. But what our source material rightly highlights is the immense darkness that was surrounding that small light. Because the Catholic bishops, they refused to sign it.
They hated it.
Oh, they despised it. They publicly called it a pact with death and hell. In their view, it was legally enshrining error, putting truth on the same level as heresy. And this tension sparked an incredible intellectual duel that really defined the next few decades. On one side, you have the authoritarian Catholic view, represented by Simon Starowolski, and on the other, the libertarian Arian view, represented by Samuel Przyzykowski.
Okay, let's look at Starowolski first, the authoritarian.
Starowolski wrote a book called Reformation and Counter-Reformation, The Reformation of Polish Mores. And his core argument is one that we still hear today in various forms. It is, freedom without law is license.
So freedom is dangerous if it's not controlled.
He believed that diversity, especially religious diversity, inevitably destroys the state. If everyone believes something different, there's no social glue, there's no unity. And without unity, the state will collapse. He had an almost totalitarian view of what was needed. One king, one law, one faith. Anything else was a recipe for disaster.
And on the other side, you have Piłsudski, the libertarian.
Yes, Piłsudski was an Aryan, a Polish brother, and his arguments for religious freedom were centuries ahead of his time. In his Dissertatio de Pax, his dissertation on peace, he argued for a clear separation of church and state.
Which is a very modern idea.
Decades before John Locke. He said the state's job is to deal with bodies and property. The church's job is to deal with souls. The two should never mix their authority. The magistrate has no right to compel conscience.
And he had help from another thinker, Jan Krell.
That's right. Krell wrote a book called Vindice pro religionis libertate, a defense of religious liberty. And his argument was psychologically brilliant. He said, if you use the power of the state to force people to believe, you don't create true Christians, you create hypocrites.
People who pretend to believe to save their own skin.
Exactly. And a hypocrite is far worse than an open heretic because a hypocrite is a liar. They corrupt the church from within. Compulsion, he argued, only breeds falsehood.
I love the wheat and tares argument they used. It's so elegant.
It is. It comes directly from a parable in the New Testament. The parable says that a farmer's field has both wheat and weeds, or tares, growing together. When the servants ask if they should pull up the weeds, the master says no.
Why not?
Because if you try to pull up the weeds, you will inevitably uproot some of the good wheat as well. You should let them both grow together until the harvest, and then they can be separated.
So the analogy is?
The state should not try to pull up the weeds, meaning execute the heretics, because that judgment belongs to God at the end of time, not to the king or the magistrate in the here and now. It's a beautiful, rational, biblical argument for tolerance.
But, spoiler alert, they lost.
They lost, badly. In the end, reason lost to fear. The sheer weight of Catholic xenophobia, which became supercharged after the Swedish deluge in the 1650s, where the Protestant Swedes invaded and devastated Poland, that just crushed them.
The Aryans were associated with the enemy.
They were seen as traitors, as a fifth column that had collaborated with the Protestant invaders. And in 1658, the Polish Sejm, the parliament, passed a decree. All Polish brethren had to convert to Catholicism or leave the country forever.
Or get out.
It's a moment that many historians see as the death of the mind for this era in Poland. The intellectual ferment just stops. Poland becomes pure and uniformly Catholic, but it also becomes intellectually isolated and stagnant.
And it wasn't just theology that was suffering. This shadow fell over everything. It fell over science, too.
It did. And for me, this is where the story gets really interesting, because the theological battle over the nature of God bleeds directly into a physical battle over the nature of the universe.
We're talking about the fight over the void.
The vacuum, yes. Now, for centuries, the philosophical backbone of the church had been Aristotle, and Aristotle had famously declared, "Nature abhors a vacuum." He argued that a true void, a space with absolutely nothing in it, cannot exist in nature.
And why was the church so attached to Aristotle's physics?
Yeah.
It seems like a strange thing to build your theology on.
Because scholastic theology, the system of Thomas Aquinas, was built directly on Aristotle's metaphysical framework. His ideas about substance and essence and potentiality, these were the tools they used to explain everything, including transubstantiation in the Eucharist. So if Aristotle is proven wrong about the physical world,
The whole house of cards could come tumbling down.
it could. It throws everything into question. And then, into this tense environment, walks a Capuchin monk named Valerian Magni, holding a glass tube.
This is the void experiment.
This is it. The year is 1647 in Warsaw. Magni performs an experiment with mercury-filled tubes, essentially creating a barometer. And as he inverts the tube, the column of mercury drops. And at the top of the sealed tube, a space appears. A vacuum.
He proved the void exists.
He demonstrated it right there in front of the king and the court. And the implication was terrifying. First, if the void exists, Aristotle is wrong. The ancient authority that has propped up philosophy for 1,000 years is flawed. And second, if there can be empty space in the universe, is God in that space? Or is it truly nothing?
Which is a deeply unsettling thought. What was the reaction?
The Jesuits responded almost immediately. A Jesuit named Wojciech Koziewicz wrote a book in response with the most incredible title, Oculus Ratione Correctus.
Which means?
The eye corrected by reason.
Wait, the eye corrected by reason? That sounds completely backwards. Shouldn't it be reason corrected by the eye by observation?
To us, yes. To him, no. His argument was that your eyes may see what appears to be a vacuum, but your reason, which is informed by correct philosophy, i.e. Aristotle and Turkish dogma, knows that a vacuum is impossible. Therefore, you should not believe what your own eyes are telling you. You must correct your flawed sensory perception with correct philosophy.
That is a perfect, chilling case of dogma blinding science. Don't look at the evidence, look at the book.
It shows you how deep the fear of the unknown, the fear of the void, really went. It was a physical manifestation of the same void the Socinians were talking about in the soul.
But some people kept looking, despite the pressure. We have Jan Hevelius in Gdańsk.
Hevelius was a brilliant astronomer. In that same year, 1647, he published his Selenographia, which was the first detailed atlas of the moon. He drew its topography. He showed it wasn't a perfect, divine, crystalline sphere as Aristotle had taught. It had mountains and craters and scars. It was a rugged physical place, just like the Earth.
It demystified the heavens.
It brought them down to Earth, literally. And then you have the really tragic figure of Jan Breuck in Krakow.
A secret Copernican.
A secret Copernican. Breuck was a brilliant mathematician and astronomer. He knew Copernicus was right. He knew the Earth revolved around the sun. He supported it privately. But he was too afraid of the church, too afraid of the intellectual climate, to publish his views openly. He hid his Copernican beliefs in his private notes and correspondence.
That's just chilling, the self-censorship. It really drives home the atmosphere of fear that had descended.
It does. It shows that while the rest of Western Europe was moving towards Descartes, Newton, and the scientific revolution, Polish thinkers were being forced into the shadows. They actively resisted Descartes and the new philosophy because they preferred the safe, known stagnation of scholasticism to the dangerous, open-ended universe the moderns were describing.
Which leads us really to our final section, the aftermath. The extinguishing of the light.
A very grim period. By the mid-17th century, after the wars and the expulsion of the Arians, the intellectual energy is just gone. The Golden Age rots into what historians often call the Saxon Night, a period of intellectual and political decline. The vibrant debates are replaced by a rigid, xenophobic certainty.
And we see this even in the brilliant minds of the time, like Marcin Szymiglecki.
Szymiglecki is a perfect example. He was a Jesuit logician, a truly brilliant man. In fact, his logic textbook was so good it was used at Oxford University for decades.
Wow.
But what did he use that brilliant logical mind for in Poland? He spent his energy writing massive treatises proving that Arians weren't Christians, labeling them new monsters. He used his formidable logic to build walls and reinforce dogma, not to explore new ideas.
And were there any exceptions? Anyone pushing back?
There was a lone voice in the wilderness, a man named Jan Zajoczkiewicz. He actually wrote in praise of eclecticism, the idea that you should seek out and take truth from all philosophical systems, not just one. But he was a complete exception. The dominant mindset was what's called the Sarmatian mindset.
Which is?
It's the belief that we, the Polish nobility, have perfected society. Our political system, our golden liberty, our Catholic faith, it is the pinnacle. Therefore, anything foreign, anything new, is by definition dangerous and corrupting. It's a culture that turns inward and stagnates.
And what's the final tragic irony of the story of the Polish Brethren?
The final irony is that after they were kicked out of Poland, they scattered across Europe. They went to Holland, to Transylvania, to England, and their books, their radical ideas about rational religion, about the separation of church and state, about the mind being a blank slate, were read by
People like John Locke.
People like John Locke, Isaac Newton, Pierre Bayle, the very thinkers who laid the groundwork for the Western Enlightenment.
So the Enlightenment.
The Western Enlightenment owes a significant, though often unacknowledged, debt to these Polish exiles. The ideas that Poland violently rejected went on to shape the modern world from the outside, while Poland itself was left pure, Catholic, and united, but also intellectually isolated and stagnant.
And that very stagnation set the stage for the political weakness and decline that led to the partitions and wiped Poland off the map a century later.
Precisely. The connection is direct.
So let's try to pull this all together. We've looked at the heretics, the inquisitors, the scientists, the preachers, and the void. What is the big takeaway here?
I think if we connect all these threads, it's a story about the devastating cost of safety. The Counter-Reformation promised safety. It promised unity. It promised that if everyone just believed the same thing and feared the same devils, the nation would be strong and secure.
But it was a trap, a devil's bargain.
It was, because by crushing the monsters of heresy, they also crushed the spirit of free inquiry. They chose certainty over truth. They chose the authority of Aristotle over the evidence of their own eyes in a glass tube.
It's a haunting lesson. The conflict at its deepest level wasn't just about theology. It was about fear. fear of the empty space in a vacuum tube, fear of the radical freedom of the human soul, and above all, fear of the other, the person who lives across the street and believes something different.
And that kind of fear, once it takes root in a culture, creates a shadow that can last for centuries.
So here's a final provocative thought for you listening at home. If the Polish Brethren had been allowed to stay, if that radical, rational ferment in places like Raków had been allowed to continue and to bubble, is it possible that Poland, not England or France, could have become the birthplace of the Enlightenment? Did the victory of safety and unity end up costing Poland its intellectual soul?
It's the ultimate tragic what-if of Polish history.
It makes you realize that sometimes, in the history of ideas, the things we label as monsters are really just people asking questions that the world isn't ready to hear.
And sometimes the scariest thing isn't the monster itself, it's the silence that comes after you've killed it.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you in the next Shadows.
Goodbye.